As I think many people know, the probe Voyager 1 has now bypassed Jupiter and sent back some really spectacular results. And in early May, we'll be devoting a whole program to those as soon as the results have been sorted out. Meantime, if you want to see Jupiter for yourself, look in the evening sky. It's in Cancer, and it's so brilliant you can't possibly mistake it. And with a telescope, you'll see its yellowish, flattened disk, the cloud belts, and the 4 bright moons. Also in the evening sky is the other giant planet, Saturn, which is in Leo, below Regulus, and is quite bright. Telescopically, not quite so beautiful as usual, I'm afraid, because the rings are now almost edge onto it, but it's still worth looking at. Early in September this year, we may get our first close-range views of Saturn, because then Pioneer 11, the probe which bypassed Jupiter in 1974, is going to make a close pass of Saturn. But we don't know quite how well that's going to work, and we may have to wait until late 1980, when Voyager 1 will rendezvous with Saturn, and I think send back really spectacular pictures. And in addition to taking a long, hard look at Saturn, Voyager 1 is programmed to have a look at Titan, the largest of Saturn's satellites. Easily visible with a small telescope, and planet-sized, is bigger than Mercury. Now, Titan has an atmosphere, which is actually denser than the atmosphere of Mars, and suggestions have been made, inevitably, that there might be some kind of life there. Well, if we're looking for life as we know it, we've got to find a world where conditions are not too unlike the conditions here. And really, you know, Titan fails every test. The atmosphere is pretty thin, it's made up of gas we couldn't breathe, and the temperature is very low. And when we come to consider exotic forms of life inside giant planets such as Jupiter and Saturn, well, I can only say that I, for one, am profoundly skeptical. But that's not to say that life can't exist elsewhere in the universe, and on the face of it, there's very good reason why it should. After all, the sun is an ordinary star. And when you look at a star field, you see there many suns, many of which are exactly the same as our own. And in fact, the sun is a very ordinary run-of-the-mill star. There's also the point that every time we've tried to set ourselves up on a pedestal, we've been proved wrong. Originally, the Earth was regarded as flat and to lie motionless in the center of the universe. Well, the Greeks knew better than that. They realized that the Earth is a globe, but most of them still believed that it lay in the center of the universe. And in the old Ptolemaic system, the Earth was in the middle and everything else went round it. That theory held good for a long, long time, in fact right until the 16th century, when the great revolution in human thought was sparked off by Copernicus and really completed by the immortal Sir Isaac Newton a century later. And they showed quite conclusively that instead of being central, the Earth is an ordinary planet moving around the sun. Then, could our sun be important? In 1838, a 5-week vessel measured the first star distance and gave us a real clue to the scale of our star system or galaxy. And it became very clear indeed that the sun is an ordinary star in a spiral system which is in slow rotation, and we lie well out from the center towards one edge. And when we look along the main plane of the system, we see many stars in more or less the same line of sight, and that gives rise to the famous Milky Way effect. So we have the star system or galaxy, which includes something like 100,000 million suns. Now, could that be unique? As recently as 1920, one of the world's great astronomers, Harlow Shapley, the man who first measured the size of our galaxy, and incidentally described it once on the Sky at Night program many years ago, was still maintaining that our galaxy was the only one, and that contained, or it was contained, the whole universe was our galaxy. Well, what then about these so-called spiral nebulae, such as the Great Spiral in Andromeda, which looked as if they were made up of stars? Could they be separate systems? This question was finally resolved in the 1920s by Edwin Hubble. He used the then largest telescope in the world, the Mount Wilson 100-inch reflector, to study certain variable stars inside the Andromeda spiral and other spirals, such as the Whirlpool and the Hunting Dogs. He could therefore find out how luminous those stars were, he could measure their distances, and he established that those systems really were independent galaxies far beyond our own. And looking further away into space, we can see galaxies so remote that they look like nothing more than patches of light. And many of the little blurs you can see in that picture are not stars, but are whole star systems. Now, if our galaxy is an ordinary galaxy, our sun's an ordinary star, then presumably our Earth is an ordinary planet. And so why shouldn't there be a great deal of life spread through the universe, living on other planets, going around other stars? And that, I think, is the popular view. We also know that the elements which make up you and me and the Earth are the same as the elements found anywhere else in the universe. But we've really got to be rather more cautious about this. because the creation of living from non-living matter does require a large amount of improbable coincidence. It's happened here, but how often it's happened elsewhere is by no means certain. One man who's suitably cautious is Professor Sir Bernard Lovell, and he gives reasons for supposing that the Earth is in some respects at least unusual. He, of course, is the great pioneer of the idea of astronomy, and he's also just published a fascinating book, In the Centre of Immensities, in which this whole problem is discussed. Well, a few days ago, I went to Jojo Bank, and I began by asking Sir Bernard whether he believed that the creation of organic from inorganic matter really was unusual.
Well, that is a difficulty, and that's why I think that the chances of life emerging elsewhere in the universe, and even given these large numbers of planetary systems, are very much less than many people believe. The difficulty is this, that when the planetary system, our own planetary system, formed from the primeval cloud about 4,500 million or 5,000 million years ago, then the planets must inevitably have had the constitution of the solar nebula. Well, the solar nebula, the primeval matter, contains about 75% hydrogen, most of the rest helium, and about 2% of heavy elements. Therefore, one would expect the planets to have atmospheres roughly with that constitution. In fact, this is the case for the outer planets. But now, obviously, it is not the case for Earth, because we couldn't possibly live in that sort of hydrogen and helium environment. Now, of course, there's no difficulty in understanding why the helium and the hydrogen have left us, because the gravitational forces on Earth were not strong enough to retain those gases. The difficulty really arises when one inquires why we don't have the 2% of heavy elements, particularly argon and neon. The inert gases, for example, they would have a lifetime on Earth of really immense, about 10 to the 200 years, and yet we don't find them here. Therefore, the argument is that something must have happened in the early history of the Earth to sweep away the primeval atmosphere. I think this is now generally accepted, and the atmosphere which we enjoy now has been the result of subsequent volcanism, eruption from volcanoes. Now, when one asks the question of how you and I have emerged under these conditions, the arguments are these, that in the very early stages, the amino acids and nucleotides could have been formed by electrical discharges through the methane and ammonia of the primeval atmosphere.
Thunderstorms, in fact.
Exactly. In fact, a laboratory experiment was done about 20 years ago by Miller and Urey in California, and they succeeded in creating the amino acids and nucleotides in this way. And the belief is that these, once the primeval atmosphere had been swept away, these early molecular constituents were dissolved in the primeval oceans. And in a very short period of time, less than 1,000 million years, these amino acids and nucleotides formed into the simplest cells. I think the real point is that we do not know how the Earth lost its primeval atmosphere, and it must have been some unique accident, very heavy bombardment, big solar flare, and therefore the assumption that any planetary system must have an Earth-like abode could be quite wrong.
The one inescapable fact is that life did appear on Earth. Do you think that was one single phenomenon of creation? It happened once and could never happen again, as I think you've said yourself.
Yes, well, I'm sure that is the case, because you have to have a star with a long period of stability of many thousands of millions of years, a steady temperature. And you see, the other problem is that the planets Mars and Venus, which have been investigated extensively by the space probes in recent years, they are completely inhospitable. And therefore, the conditions for the emergence of life have been very narrowly determined by the size and mass of the Earth and its distance from the Sun. You have to have a lot of unusual conditions satisfied in the planetary system before you get a habitable atmosphere.
Well, certainly that puts an entirely new complexion upon matters, and I put a direct question to Sir Bernard. Did he think that life in the universe must be extremely rare?
We don't know. We have no evidence on which to guide us, but I think the assumption that in the solar neighborhood all the stars are surrounded by planets containing intelligent life is quite erroneous.
This brings me back to something I said earlier. Not all stars seem to be suitable candidates as centers of planetary systems. In Orion, for example, the two leaders, Betelgeuse and Rigel, are immensely powerful stars and quite unsuitable. So we've got to look for stars like the Sun, and this means that our choice of suns for other Earths is limited. All the same, do we have any good grounds for regarding ourselves as exceptional?
I think that any civilization which emerged anywhere in the universe would inevitably have this great opinion of itself. The reason is very simple, that quite apart from these local conditions in the last few thousand million years leading to the emergence of ourselves, that the universe we observe has to be exactly what it is in order for us to be here to observe it. And this must apply to any other set of beings anywhere in the universe.
Do you think there's any chance at all that life on Earth really is unique?
It could be. After all, I was always brought up in the belief that life must be unique because the formation of this planetary system was a very rare event. Astronomically, the situation is completely different now. We do not think we are unique in that sense.
We can be certain about one thing anyway. There's no advanced life in our solar system away from the Earth. But we've already sent men to the moon, and we are talking about colonizing other planets on our own account. And I asked Sir Bernard whether he believed that to be either possible or desirable.
With regards to possibility, I would say yes, in principle. The question is whether it's done. It depends on a lot of other things. What is going to happen in the world, where the money goes. If one puts enough money and effort into it, if one put all the money and effort which now goes into the defense budgets of the great nations, then one could do this. I mean, one could have got a man to Mars by this time. And no doubt, given technical development, with immense resources, which the world could put into it if it wanted to, over the next 50 years or the next century, one could do this. With what's been done in our own lifetime. It would have been fantastic when I was a young man to have thought that getting a man to the moon was anything for science fiction.
Absolutely so, yes.
And the question of desirability is very interesting because it is not impossible, of course, that the world may be driven to this. If there is some ghastly accident, the ghastly nuclear accident, or if the environment is spoiled within the next 50 years or 100 years in some irretrievable wealth, or the balance of the environment is extremely delicate, then one may be forced to put one's efforts into colonization of some other planet like Mars or Venus and engineering the atmosphere in order to save the human race.
But of course, both Mars and Venus are rather inhospitable places, and life there would have to be under very artificial conditions, surely.
But a lot of life is led under artificial conditions. After all, if you fly in a jet across the Atlantic, you live in a completely artificial condition. And if one goes to a lecture one never sees any daylight. A lot of human life now is carried out under completely artificial conditions. And there is no reason why, if it became absolutely necessary, that for the sake of survival, one would live in completely artificial environments on the moon or on Mars or on Venus. Of course, there is another possibility which people have talked about, and I'm not competent to judge this, and this is just a question of what is called the engineering of the atmospheres in order to make them habitable. But I imagine nobody really understands yet how that could be done, but it might be possible.
Well, so far, I think we've tended to be a bit parochial. We've confined ourselves to the solar system. But there's certainly no advanced life here outside the Earth. So if we are hoping to find other intelligence, we've got to go outside. And the nearest stars which are anything like the Sun are two called Tor Cetae and Epsilon Eridani. And Epsilon Eridani is just one of the tiny dots in that photograph that I took some time ago. And even those two stars are over 11 light years away. That means that a radio wave, which travels at the same speed of light, would take 11 years to get there and another 11 to get back. So even sending messages would be extremely difficult. And once we talk about sending material probes, well, we're dealing in periods of thousands or millions of years, so it simply can't be done. At the present moment, then, the only possible means of contacting other intelligence seems to be by radio, and even that seems a very long shot indeed. Therefore, if we are hoping to maintain full contact with any beings in other solar systems, I think we've got to put our faith in something very much more futuristic. And I asked Sir Bernard whether he thought it would ever be possible to make contact with other intelligences.
I would say it was extremely unlikely. It's, of course, like many other people with big telescopes, we've been pressed to attempt communication with any civilized beings which might exist around the nearest star. But I've always resisted that purely on probability grounds that one can't spend the time on such an improbable exercise. And as you know, there's been a joint proposal from the Americans and the Soviet Union to spend a vast sum of money on building a gigantic system of telescopes to do this communication.
Cyclops.
Cyclops, indeed. Even so, with the best that we could do with modern technology on Earth, one could only establish communication with the stars within 10 or 20 light years of the solar system, a negligible part of the Milky Way, an insignificant part of the universe. And the chances of any intelligent beings being there are so remote that I simply don't think it's worthwhile. One can never exclude the possibility of accident. After all, a lot of the discoveries during the last 20 years in astronomy have been made purely by accident. But I think the answer really is that any rational judgment would say that it's going to be impossible to establish communication. But being a scientist and having lived through a most remarkable epoch of scientific history, I would be reluctant to say no, never.
Well, admittedly, the chances are very slim, but they're not absolutely nil. And of course, there have been some attempts made before now. About nearly 20 years ago, there was the famous Project Ozma, Green Bank, West Virginia, when Dr. Frank Drake and his team used the radio astronomy equipment there to try and pick up rhythmical signals from the systems, if they exist, of those two stars I mentioned, the Taur Cetae and Epsilon Eridani. Well, not surprisingly, they failed, but there have been other attempts since then. Obviously, the equipment at Jodrell Bank would be extremely suitable for this kind of thing, but it would tie up the equipment for a very long time. And I asked Sir Bernard whether he thought that in view of all the uncertainties of it all, whether he thought that the time spent on an investigation like this would really be something of a waste of time.
Oh yes, I think it would. In fact, just in the ordinary course of astronomical research, I happen to have been engaged on a program which during the last 20 years has led me to look at these nearby stars. So far we've built out about 20,000 hours of observation. Well, the astronomical results have been very interesting, but those astronomical results have shown that it's extremely unlikely that the conditions there are such that life could emerge. And if there had been anybody trying to communicate with us, they would certainly have done so with the telescope at Jodrell Bank.
One last question. If we have a planet like the Earth, orbiting a star like the Sun, and there must surely be plenty of cases of that in our galaxy, would you think that life might evolve there in exactly the same way as it's done here?
I think if life is going to emerge at all, the very high probability that it must inevitably be along the same lines as it has emerged on Earth, simply because of the distribution of elements. After all, the cosmic abundance of the elements is rigidly determined. It was determined in the very early stages of the evolution of the expansion of the universe 10,000 million years ago. And the cosmic abundance is about 75% hydrogen, and about the rest, nearly all the rest, helium, and a very small percentage of the heavy elements which have come subsequently from thermonuclear processes in the interior of stars. And therefore one cannot play about with the constitution of the elements. It was determined a long time ago, at the very earliest stages of the expansion of the universe. And hence, if the conditions are such that life is going to emerge anywhere, it, I think, must inevitably be the sort of life that we know on Earth.
I think this has been a very significant discussion because it's so easy to swing from one extreme to the other. Originally, our Earth was believed to be flat, central and all-important. Then it was shown that the Earth is an ordinary planet orbiting the Sun, and the opinion swung right the other way, and it became generally thought that life in the universe must be widespread. Well, this evening, we've heard the balanced view that life on Earth may not be unique, but life in the universe may not be nearly so common as some people think. I wonder if we'll ever know. I suppose someday a great radio telescope may pick up the rhythmic signals from another solar system which will show that intelligence does or did exist there, but it's a very long shot. And at the moment, we've no proof either way. Perhaps one day we'll know. Good night.